from one language to another. You can translate from one language to another. You can translate from into a completely different science system. That is, from to images, into movies, into a different genre, drama, theater, cinema. As I was saying. But you also know when you go across, when you're driving on the road, you see signs everywhere, visual signs everywhere. But you read them in language. Stop. It's not saying, it may not say stop at all, but you recognize the light, red light, or a dot, and you say stop. Right? So you're translating. And that's one of the things I was, before going to translating in a classroom, I was going to say that we translate all the time. In a multilingual society, of course, you translate all the time. You live in 2 or 3 languages, a language at home, maybe 2 languages at home, maybe 3 languages at home, maybe a different language outside the home, maybe a completely different language in the classroom, or different languages in the classroom. So we move across languages all the time. We use different languages to interact with different people, and the languages colliding all the time in our head, so much so that sometimes we know the right word for something in one language and not another. And that's in your head. So when you're speaking English, suddenly the right word may come in Tamil, because you know Tamil, and the word you think of comes to you in Tamil. So it's the image, that you have. That's one we're looking at, translation, how we live our lives in translation. The other is to simply go back to first principles and to say all language is translation. All verbal signs are translations, because you're looking at the world around you, and each object in that world is being represented by a word, which is completely arbitrary associative. So you can recognize that immediately, because who in English said a tree was a tree first? Who gave it that name? How did that name go around? How did it find acceptance? It's an act of translation. A new word is created to stand for something, and that word gains currency, and it's the accepted translation. So languages are made up of translations of other science systems, if you wish, other objects, actions, and all of it accepted by a group of people as acceptable, usable translation. And that's what a language is. That's what a science, that the science system is. That, therefore, if you think of translation as the very beginning, in the beginning was the translated word, which is not too fanciful. If you think about the Bible, because almost every Bible translator will talk about the Greek original. And you know that the Greek could not have been the original. How could the Old Testament or the New Testament be in Greek first? It comes from a different part of the world. So you also know, therefore, about the Septuagint translation Bible, Greek Bible, where they were trying to put together the testaments, and they had people sitting in different cells and asked to write it in Greek, and everybody miraculously wrote the same Greek version. And that is the original. And if that is the original, you realize the original is translation, because it didn't exist in Greek before. It was coming from a complete different language. So to talk about the word in the beginning of the word, in really speaking, the word came to you in translation, right? So if translation is intrinsic to our life, intrinsic to language itself, then it is something that all of us are familiar with, all of us teach, all of us practice. Not just familiar with, we teach children. We teach little nephews and nieces and how to talk various things, how to say things in a different language. We teach, we practice. Right? It's messy. Language is messy, as you know. Every science system is messy because it doesn't convey everything clearly. You're always short of words. You always can't find the right word. You always are dissatisfied with what you've written, what you said, right? Because translation is never perfect. It always has to be abandoned. You just have to make the best of it and say done, right? And this is what we do when we converse with each other. Very often our conversations are perfected later on. After the conversation is over, we go back and think about it, and you realize you could have said this and you could have said that, and this could was what that other person meant but did not say clearly, etc. So you all this is after the fact. Why? Because we are poor. Translations can never be perfect. They can always be worked on, always be worked on, right? And I'm not even talking about repartees and how well you make, because that's a part of narrativization. We go back and make ourselves heroes. You say, you then next time you tell someone what happened, you say things you never said actually. And then I said this, but you didn't say it. But you said it in imagination later on. And that makes you feel good and makes you look good. But that's another aspect. But all these are, in a sense, translations in the Indian tradition, if you think about it, because in most languages in India, all languages have this term, but some languages have other terms too. Anuvad is the major term for translation in the subcontinent. As I said, every language has its own term as other term, but Anuvad carries is a common term in most Indian languages. And Anuvad means to speak after, to repeat, to speak after. It's temporal, which is what we do when we narrate in events that have happened. We are speaking after.
Terribly.
So in a sense, it is like translation. It is translation. You're speaking after, repeating after. It changes. Translation always changes. Translation can never be the same as the original, because if it is, then it's not a translation. Then it's not a translation. Because if I give you Shakespeare in English, the folio, whatever, authorized Shakespeare, and I give it to you and say, this is a translation, you will read it and say, what's the translation? No, this is Shakespeare. So I'll have to invent something that it's a translation of, otherwise it's not. It's not my translation of Shakespeare, Shakespeare speaking to you in Shakespeare's language. So a translation always means change. And if it means change, then we're all translators all the time, within the language, outside the language, whatever you want to say. So I hope this is getting simpler rather than more complicated. But the fact is that most people think this is not translation, what I'm saying. What they think translation is from one language to another, and saying in another language what was said in the first language, clearly what was said in the first language. The example I normally give, and I have no, okay, I have not it here. Right. So the example I give is from maths, physics, science, not biology. That has a different meaning for translation. But in translation means an object going across space and time, as this has done now, across space and time. But at the end of the journey, every molecule of this object is in the same relationship to all other molecules of the object as it was in the beginning, before it traveled across space and time. So that you have the same object in front of you. So most people think literary translation is like that. So I read Marquez in Hindi, I read Marquez in English, I may read Marquez in Gujarati, Bengali, Tamil. It's the same Marquez that was written in a completely different language. We read Marquez. We don't say we're reading the translator. Actually, reading the translator. You don't even know the name of the translator. You don't even bother about it. You're reading Marquez. You're reading anything you're reading in translation, you're reading the original, as far as you're concerned. How can that be? It cannot be the original. It cannot be the original because it's in a completely different language through the mediation of a translator. So it is going from one linguistic culture into another, also across time very often. So something written 2 centuries ago cannot have the same impact on us in a language. It cannot travel across languages and across time. Same impact I come to later on, which is why I backed off the same impact. That's the other thing of translation. Very often, that's the next point, but very often people think it also should have the success of a translation, they think, is in the fact that it has the same impact on its readership as the original had on its readership. That, of course, is impossible to even judge. impossible even to judge and impossible to aim for. After all, the translate, ultimately I'm saying, even if the translator believes this, it's not possible. But most translators don't even aim for this. Most translators are giving you their interpretation, with their emphasis of reading of the literary text that they're translating. Why do they like the literary text? Why do they think it's going to work for the readership in this particular language at this moment? That is what they're getting across. That is what they're working towards, right? So not maybe they're getting a new form in, like uh, Michael Madhusudan. That, you think about it. People who bring the sonnet across, people who bring the blank verse across, what they're really doing is to give you a new form in the language from a different language. So if they're translating, or they're actually getting a form, like people writing, uh, you in English, like Aga Shahid Ali did, right? To get an Urdu form across the ghazal into English, a Persian Urdu form into English. So when you take across form, that's your aim. That's your aim, right? So what are you doing? Why are you translating? That's an important question to ask yourself as a translator. And it's a great question to ask of translators. When you read a translation, to try and see what is the translator actually doing this for? What is the translator doing it for? What is the political question that the translator wants to address? And that is not too far from what is the aesthetic question that the translator wants to address. What is that lack in ideology or ways of thinking that the translator wants to address? For example, a student of mine, of ours in center, Dinesh Kafle, who translates into Nepali, translated a Malayalam novel about Benjamin's Malayalam novel about workers in West Asia and the Middle East, if you want. He translated that into Nepali. He doesn't know Malayalam. He did it from English. And I asked, which will lead us to some other aspect of translation later on. I asked him, yeah, but why did you do this one? There's so many novels to translate. Why did you translate from a novel which is already coming to you in English translation? Because it's you are twice removed in a certain sense from the Malayalam. So why do this first? And he said, sir, it is addressing something which is of concern, which is of relevance to Nepalis. Because in the Middle East, you have Nepalis working in the same roles, maids, workers, just like you have Filipinos, just like you have Sri Lankans. You have all of them out there. So this is talking about a life, an experience out there, which Nepalis should know, understand, think about, engage with. So I translated this. It is not available. Nothing like this has been written in Nepali yet. So I did this. Right. So you always have a translator's intent. What is the translator trying to do? Which is why earlier people would say translation does violence to the violence. It means it actually tries to change the language, the linguistic culture, the ways of thinking of the people. That is the language that the translation is going into, that the book text is being translated into. You translate into that language to change the people, to change the culture, to make people rethink, which is even aesthetically, to think of what is what is good form, what is to bring in a new form, to give them ways of thinking. It's doing violence to that language, which is why it was said. Now, sorry, let me just make sure that I don't overshoot my times. I'm halfway through the talk, more than halfway through, right? So I was talking about, the thing is translation classroom, but I'm saying translation in our life, right? Translation plays such a major role in our life, and we look at translation all the time without recognizing it. Even when we see what we see as a translation, read a book, translated book, we don't think of it as translation. That was the point I was making by bringing in Dinesh Kafle and saying, look, think of what the translator was doing. I asked him and he told me what he was doing, right? So it is not that the Nepali reader reading Dinesh Kafle is reading about Malayalis. He's reading about, she is reading about, they are reading about the plight of the workers, the life of the workers in the Middle East. So Malayali goes out of the picture. They're reading it in Nepali, they're thinking in Nepali, right? So it is, they're thinking about all workers out there, all workers out there. So this is what the translation attempts and gain and succeeds in doing and succeeds in doing. Now, when I was talking about through English, I just quickly come to that because we are English. Most of us are, I think all of us are from English classrooms, and we know that the English classroom is very often treated in this country wrongly as a monolingual classroom. It is not a monolingual classroom. It's a multilingual classroom. It's always been. It will always be, and it will be a pity when it actually becomes monolingual, right? It will be a pity. What have most teachers, successful, good teachers, always tried? What have most students, very good students, think scholars always tried, is to mine this, is to think of this as a kind of enrichment of the classroom space and the space of scholarship, and to build on this multilingualism, to bring in our different experiences from our different languages. Because in India itself, we have different linguistic communities which are completely different worldviews, very often, different cuisines, different understanding of culture, different understanding by which ways of life, including even within the same linguistic community. Even within the same linguistic community, because of our because we're multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and within religion we have so many stratifications that we all have our, and finally into the family, our ways of eating, the food we eat, the music we like, the way we dress, everything changes. Everything changes, even within the same linguistic community. In fact, the language itself changes completely within the same linguistic community. If you go from one community within it to another, from one region to another, it changes. Right. So, in a sense, in our family, in our interaction, in our own language community, we practice translation all the time. Right. We understand each other. I would just say someone speaking Madurai Tamil, somebody speaking Madras Tamil. When they talk to each other, they're translating each other all the time. Right. And trying to figure it out. And they're also trying to translate their language so other person will understand better. They both speak in Tamil. They're both speaking Tamil. And when you talk across caste lines, when you talk across sometimes gender lines, when you talk, you actually try again, translate all the time. And that is a language sometimes seems very obscure to you or very secretive to you. It happens. Right? So if we bring in all these experiences into the reading of English texts, into our classroom, that I read an English text and I am reading along with it Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, just name all the languages, Bodo, Metai, all the languages that I can think of. Those experiences are coming into the classroom. Both the reading, listening, and living experiences are coming to the classroom. How much more enriched our classroom would be? This is what I'm talking about when I say translation in the classroom should happen within the heads of individuals, but should happen in the conversation. Should happen in the conversation. What does that do? It actually makes us aware, as I said, of our roles of translation, but also as translators, that also makes us look at language closely and linguistic experience, worldviews closely. The words, the impact of words closely. Right? We can read most literary texts politically, easily, without being forced to by theory, because we are pitting our experience against that experience, right? Which is an extremely political act. It's an extremely political act, right? Once we start doing this, there's also understanding that comes about. There's also a kind of understanding of each other that comes about. I'm not saying you embrace various ways of life, but your ways of life change. I tell my translation class that we don't need Rushdie to tell us about what is translation, being translated. We are all translated. Look at the clothes we wear, look at the favorite foods, look at the success of chains like McDonald's and Pizza Hut, and Starbucks. So we're all translated people all the time because the world impinges on us and we in turn impinge on the world. We change the world changes us. This is translation. And a good classroom in India, which is aware, even a bad classroom, even in a classroom where awareness is not there, this is happening. this is happening. But if you are aware of it, it can be even better. The other thing that I want to talk about, because in terms of doing English literature, is that in translation theory, people talk about something which is should be obvious to all of us, which is the polysystem theory. That because we think of the world as a construct anyway, that's what literary theory does to us. And you think of a construct of different kinds of systems. We are living amidst this whole network of systems. And in the network of systems, literature is one system. And we live in a system of literatures, because we don't just read English, we just don't live in English, right? So there are other literatures that are impinging on us. Even when you're reading in English, we read French in translation in English very often. We read European drama, right? We read poetics. So we read various kinds of text in translation in any case, so the other literaries. But bringing the idea of translation as part of this is that we also like to look at how translation in a particular linguistic literary system, right? In a particular language and its literary system, translation plays a role, right? So Marquez may play a role in Bengali literature. Marquez may play a role in Tamil literature, just as Foucault may play a role in Tamil literature and literary criticism as in Bengali, right? So I'm just take two examples. Anybody, right? So what is the role of a particular of translation in a particular system, policy in a literary system? Sometimes can be central. In terms of criticism, for example, for a very long time, I think perhaps even now, but I will not say this, Western literary theory had a central role in our various languages in their critical discourse, right? So Namwar Singh, a major figure, was often an interpreter and a user of Western literary theory in Hindi, right? So when he was the major figure, which I know at that era I know well, Western literary theory and its translation, whether clearly talked of as translation or as used in in Hindi without being called translation, just central to Hindi criticism. It was central. So at a particular point of time, a translated text can be central to your system. At other times, they can be marginal. If people say, you're talking West, I'm not just talking about West. Let's take, in most Indian languages, the role played by the translation of Ramayana and Mahabharata. I'm not saying all Indian languages, it's not true, but in most Indian languages it happens, right? And what happens when Ramayana and the Mahabharata are translated into the Indian language, that Indian language gains in stature. It becomes a worthy language, a language that can have this. Ramayana and Mahabharata is a language of stature. It reaches the status of Sanskrit, all right? When it does that, it does so because there is Ramayana or the Mahabharata in that language. That's central to the language at that particular point of time. So, and which of course leads me to again think of translation from our perspective, because it is saying after, in a sense, it's rewriting. Therefore, the rewriter is a very important person. The fact is, we're not very sure of historical locations of various people, but we talk of Valmiki Ramayana, of course, which itself comes after various Ramayans, the Valmiki Ramayana. And then we talk of Kamba Ramayana, we talk of Tulsi Ramayana, right? So we talk of various people writing in different languages as the writers of Ramayana in their language, not translators. Kamban actually doffs his turban, if you want, to Valmiki. He says, I stood at the shore of the sea that Valmiki is. And therefore, what he's saying is, I can't get that sea. I'm just standing here. I've experienced it. Now I'm giving you my version. Right? So when he says that, he doffs it. But no one ever thinks of Kamba Ramayana as a translation. Nobody does. It's Tamil in its ethos, in what it does, the ways it even names people, everything becomes Tamil, including the fact that he he makes Ram a god. So Valmiki has to explain Ram as an ideal human being and give you explanation for all that he does. For Kamban, Ram is God. How can you understand why he does what he does? How do you understand God? So that doesn't matter. It's bhakti, right? Also, he has to introduce the element of romance. So he has to show Ram and Sita falling in love before the Swayamvar. Which is not there, Valmiki, right? But why not? And so much so that the Malayalam version of Ramayana actually has Sita tell Rama when he tells her not to come to the forest with him. She says, there have been so many Ramayanas before this. Have you ever heard of a Sita who didn't go to the forest? So why are you arguing with me? She tells Rama. The kind of self-reflexivity. But then when you think about it, the Valmiki is also extremely self-reflexive. And why is that so? I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away a bit. I'll get back to us. But why is that self-reflexive? Who writes according to everybody? Who's written that Ramayana? Valmiki. But isn't Valmiki a character in the Ramayana? So here is somebody who's known as the author of the epic, but is also a character in the epic and plays major role in the epic. So it's an interesting postmodern text, you may think. But the point I'm making is that it comes after so many other Ramakathas, that there are things that are done and are possible to do because these are all rewritings. And if you think of it in those terms, I'm not even, when I started off almost like major Latin American translation theorists, even Octavia Paz, whose thing is there is no original. It's always translated because language is always translated. Language in itself is a translation. Right. So that's Octavia Paz. It's not something I made up. It's something that's accepted. Right. Now, so sorry. I was talking about how in our terms, the translator is actually a writer, and a translation work is actually an original in the language. Right? We don't think of it as original translation at all. Those are not terms we use. We think of a text. We think of commentary. The commentary is as important as the text. The Tika tradition, the commentary tradition, is very important. And we think of the commentary writers, we actually hold them up as the same level as the writers of those texts. The commentary is as important to us. Right? So it's a different tradition that we come from. I try to distinguish between this. This is a shorthand. This is not completely true, but I would just like to say that a lot of Western translation theory, though as I said, many people will disagree also, but a lot of it comes from the fact that it begins, the idea of theorizing begins with the translation of the central text, holy text, the Bible. Right. So Saint Jerome's words, when he's translating it, when he said that I do not do it word for word, but sense for sense, we still hold on to today. Right. Not word for word, but sense for sense. Those are the terms which comes from earlier. It's actually echoing Cicero. I don't know how to pronounce it. Cicero, who actually, when he's talking about speaking in Latin, he said, I don't do what interpreters do, which means translators do, which is give you word for word glossing for the Greek text. I actually take it and make it my own and speak it to get the emotive response. Right. So from there on to St. Jerome, to the Bible translation, word for word, sense for sense, has ruled Western ways of thinking to the extent that wherever I go, I can look at it in those terms. Schleiermacher was another major thinker, well into the second millennium, and there he is a German, and Germans of course are major theoreticians. And Schleiermacher brings in the next term, if you want, where he says, listen, those terms are all right, but what is most important for a translator? And he makes a distinction between commercial text, translators of commercial text, and translators of other kinds of text, creative, spiritual, literary text. And he says for the other translator, what is important is whether you take the text to the reader in the new language, or do you take the reader to the text? So that, are you close to the writer of the original and expect the reader to work to understand, or do you get closer to make it easier for the reader to understand? Go closer to the reader, which Venuti in the 20th century said, talked of in terms of foreignization and domestication, right? So you foreignize the text so that it reads, when you're reading it, you're aware all the time that you're reading a translation, or do you domesticate it that the reader is not aware that they are reading a translation, right? Most publishers would like you to, in a sense, pretend that it is written in the language that the reader is reading. They don't want you to remind the reader at all. They don't even want to put the name of the translator on the front cover, right? Because when you buy a Marquez, you're buying Marquez. And when you read Marquez, read so well in English, should never be aware there's a translation, start thinking about translation. Commercial publishers don't want that, right? So this foreignization, domestication, most academics want foreignization, most commercial publishers want domestication, right? That's basically it, because when you're translating, you want people you're translating for very often as an academic, you want them to see that's a different worldview that comes from a different linguistic culture, and to be aware of how that culture approaches everything, including language, and how the language, gives you a certain knowledge system. So you want to go there, take the reader there, foreignize it. But according to publishers, readers who are not academic readers do not want this. They want easy reads. So you domesticate for it. So I talked about, just to quickly tell you, Jacobson, Schleiermacher, the ancient Cicero, Saint Jerome. I've talked about Venuti. I've talked about polysystem theory. The theoretical position I like the most, of course, and I'm exceeding my time, is this is for those of you who translate or who want to translate, the minimax theory. The minimax theory, I tell people, is minimum effort, maximum result. What it means, all technical translators know this, because what they have is a template. Once they got worked out a template for, let's say, a tender document or a bid or a scientific document from one language to another, all they then need to do each time is to fill in the blanks. Most words, they're worked out. They'll all be the same. The rest, they fill in. That's what they have to work hard on. The same way for literary translators. Once you translate it 3 or 4 or 5 times from one language into another language, same 2 languages, you worked out most things for yourself. Once you read translations like that, you worked out most things. If you know 2 languages and you stick to the translations from one language to another, different translations, you know what has worked, what is easy, what you don't need to worry about, what phrases become this. So those you do easily. Whatever comes easily, you do without thinking about it. And then the difficult questions come, and that you spend time on. If you spend time on each word, each sentence, it's going to be difficult. Right, let's go back to what Jacobson said. Jacobson said, I'm going to end with this. Jacobson said, and this is something that is so simple that all of us should know. Jacobson said, or Jacobson, let me just make it easier. Jacobson said that what you need to is that when you have translate from one language to another, you need to realize that since the worldviews are different, you're always looking for an equivalence when equivalence is not possible. Right? But you're looking for it. And you're trying to find something that will work for this. Right. Now, when he says that, what does he mean? He says, for example, when you want to say paneer in English, what do you say? He doesn't say this. I'm giving an example. He says cottage cheese in Russian. Right. Same way, when you say brahmachari in English, how do you say it? Right. Simply celibate work, or do you need to say more? Right? What do you need to say? What does it mean to you? Right? How do you say it? But what he says very often, there are things that must be done. For example, if gender has to be ascribed in the other language, you have to ascribe it. Some languages have different notions of gender. Gender works different ways in that language. You don't routinely make the bus a feminine or a masculine in English, but when writing in Hindi, you do. Bengalis have great trouble with most languages because it is a genderless language, more or less, right? So what do you do in your translation? Certain things are necessary. Articles are necessary in English, not necessary in other languages, right? In our language, we hardly ever say parents in most Indian languages, we say mother, father, right? So, but when you translate to English, you don't say mother, father, you say parents. So there are certain things that are necessary, right? You have to do because it's grammatically asked for. Grammar asks for it. Other things you have to work on. Other things you have to work on. That is what Jacobson is saying. Fine. This leads me to the last person I'm going to mention today, because we've really run out of time, which is a major Bible translator, very well known in translation studies, called Naida. Right? What Naida worked on, and he's used all the time, he said because he was interested in proselytizing, converting. Right? He was talking about Bible translation and theorizing from Bible translation in order to take the Bible into different languages to convert people. And you know, in India, most Indian languages completely were standardized in a certain way with Bible translation, right? I talked about epics, but you know, in the 19th century, in the 18th century, 19th century, sometimes even the early 20th century, many languages in India were standardized by the Christian missionaries with translating the Bible with the sermons, etc., etc. Print comes in there, right? And the print standardization comes to the Bible as well. So Naida talks about formal equivalence, which is almost like word for word, and dynamic equivalence. Now, dynamic equivalence is where you try and get the sense across. And I'll end here. You can understand what he's trying to do, because how do you talk about the Christian God in a language which may have a word for God already? How do you differentiate between the Christian God and this God? What are the things you have to do in a completely different language and culture to make the Bible not just acceptable, but profound, foremost, the first text? I said last, but think of it, if when you take the Bible to a culture which thinks of drinking as sin, what happens to wine? The references to wine. What happens to wine in the church? Interesting things to think about, right? When you go across cultures. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry, I'm giving you very little time for questions, but please go ahead. More than questions, comments.
If you have any questions or comments, you can raise your hand. I'll ask you to unmute. Indu has a question.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a great pleasure hearing you after so long time. And I was gladly waiting you to hear again on the translation doing in Indian classrooms. And you very well elaborated on it. I had two questions. One which I am trying to figure out, even I'm struggling with my own work, and I'm trying to figure out what to do and how to study the work when there is no translator's note there. So the translator has not talked about the intentions of translation, but to some extent, because it is a text which is located, it's an experience by a person who lives in a different language, I mean, in a different state, and but has experienced days here in the place where I live, and has written it in her own language. And the translation is done in English. So I'm just giving you a background of how to think about the translator's note over there. And my second, I don't know if it's a comment or it's a question, but also it is for you to elaborate on it. So when you said that you know that Ramayana and Mahabharata, when it is getting translated in some other languages, there is a stature that is given to the other language as
The
well.
past.
The target language. Oh,
In
okay.
the past, not now. In the past.
Oh, okay. I think I just confused with the understanding that there is a stature given to the language, the target language that the
For
that is.
example, when in Marathi, one of the things that happens is Ganeshwar says, my language is now the language when he's translating.
Okay.
So it's a kind of, circulation, acceptance of that, of one's own language in the one. You are actually not in your own eyes, but you want it to be the eyes of your community, right? You don't want them to look elsewhere for anything, right?
But then I'm thinking, if there is a presupposition of the notion that the language is already it is not of that stature. So you have already thought that that this language.
हो गया पढ़ा चुकी मैं
That's
अपना
what-
देख रही हूँ आज बंद कर दिया अपन पढ़
Indu, I'm sorry. I'm interrupting you, but I thought I understand.
No. There's this another individual who.
But I understand where you're going, because remember, there's always a power equation. There are always powerful languages. For example, English in the world right now, right? There are always languages which are powerful. There are always languages which are not so powerful, right? So this role was played by Sanskrit in India. This role has been played by Persian in India, right? So in the language of power. So what happens is when you're asserting your power, your own languages and your own power in your situation, very often you take the other language on. And some Tamil throughout resists Sanskrit, the northern language. The Tolkappiyam, the earliest extant grammar in any Indian language, I would think, Tolkappiyam is full of rules for how you keep Sanskrit out, and doesn't call it Sanskrit ever, always calls it the northern language. Right? How to guard your frontiers of your language and your culture. It even says, okay, Ramayana is interesting, but then it should never be Lakshman. It should be Ilakuvan. It gives you rules about how to Tamilize when you're forced to take something from the northern language. Tamilize it, right? So it's an interesting that it's always this understanding of power struggle and always understanding of assertion and subversion and power in India, right? In different languages. The point was, for me, is that while taking from that language, supposedly from Sanskrit, you're actually then saying, I don't need you. I'm there, right? This is what is being done through the 15th and 16th century in most Indian languages. From the 12th century onwards towards 16th century, almost all languages were breaking free, right? And establishing their own hegemonies, because it's not as if they were free of power structures. Right? Remember, our India is full of these even now. If you think of Odia is that which is not Bengali. If you think of Assamese, it's that which is not Bengali. If you look eastwards, to northeast from Assam, they are not Assamese, right? So, and then Kannada is not Tamil. Malayalam is not Tamil. You know what I mean? There's this whole thing of fighting the hegemony of Tamil there, fighting the Bengali hegemony out there, right? And Assamese hegemony elsewhere. And to the extent that Arunachal, where there's 200 languages, they said to me, mutually unintelligible, so therefore they speak in Hindi to each other. So I was very surprised. I said, because in my head, it was that they could speak English, as many others in the Northeast do. So how come they speak Hindi to each other? So I asked a major writer, I said, why do you speak in Hindi to each other? They said, oh, because it is not Assamese. And that led to thinking on my part. And I said, oh, they want to speak in a language of mainland India because all the states in the Northeast, that is one state which wants to be part of India because it does not want to be part of China. Right? So it wants the Indian military presence, it wants the defenses, and therefore they're willing to speak a mainland language and speak Hindi. But they will not speak Assamese. because that is hegemonic. It's interesting, isn't it? When you look around.
Yeah.
One more example of this kind of translation. I'm sorry that I raised hands, but this I tell my class, there would never have had been a Naga movement, because again they speak mutually unintelligible languages. How do they talk to each other? A movement needs language. They need to talk to each other, to fight, to come together. They speak Nagamese. So Assamese mixed with various Naga dialects becomes Nagamese, a looked down upon market language, but it was a language for that struggle, language of the struggle. So it's interesting the role that languages play, that power plays, and how you accommodate, use that language of power, but still use it against that language of power. What do you do to assert? Right? That's a very interesting thing. Sorry, I saw some other raised hand. I should keep quiet.
If there are any other questions,
I think there was. That's why I'm shutting up.
I didn't see any.
I think, sir,
I think that was Indu.
Again.
So she did not put her hand down.
I'm sorry.
There is one question in the chat by Dinesh where he asks, is translation possible in Indian classroom? I think you've answered it, but I would also like to add something.
Sure.
When you were talking about Indian universities and especially English studies, I was also thinking of the school where I come from. So it's an ICSE school, which is kind of an like full of Anglophiles. So there, how English becomes a kind of a parameter for one's intellect, and also Hindi or any other language for that matter is seen to be something which is a language which should be abstained, like you should abstain from using it in schools. So how do we change, as obviously we'll be professors, teachers, or as translators, as anyone in the academia, how do we change it, and how can it help bringing local languages into the classroom?
It's a difficult question. It's a very difficult to practice, right? Because I practice at the upper end, so it's easy for me to say some things. It may not be practical in schools unless it needs a lot of effort by individual teachers and a system that allows that effort, right? So at the university level, at the time I was teaching, I was lucky to retire when I retired before it became worse. A teacher in a classroom is allowed to do what she wanted to do. So what I did from the beginning, let's say when I taught poetry, for example, was to tell people to make the syllabus themselves, to bring in poets from any language that they liked. And I said only thing, any language that you know and like. It should be language you know. You should read that poet in that language, right? So we will see how translations can be made available. You will make a presentation on that poet. You will be speaking from and your reading of that poet in that language. But we will have read that poet in a different language, most of us, if we don't know that language. And we'll be bringing in our reading of the translation and pitting it against your reading of the text in the main language, in the language the writer wrote it. So automatically different kinds of readings came to the classroom. So I remember those courses with great fondness because we talked about everything in the world. There was people who knew French, there were people who knew Spanish. So we did Neruda in the original, in the presentation, and the rest of us were talking about Neruda. And some of them had read Neruda in Malayalam. So it would come in Malayalam translation also into the classroom, right? And I realized how much translation had gone on in some South Indian languages of Latin American texts, right? So this is possible. It is possible to do this where you can make your own syllabus. But it's also possible with a set syllabus to ask people to bring in writers that they like and the writers they're reminded of by the poems that they're reading or the text they're reading, right? And to pit that against each other. To talk about even things like magic realism, to talk about in terms of how narratives in our languages have done things, have looked at things, looked at supernatural, looked at time, looked at space differently all the time. Right. And then to bring in that how people have done it elsewhere as well. So we can actually always, even when we concentrate on one literary text in English. We look at an English syllabus done in English. We can ask people to bring in their languages and their experiences, right? We can, and classroom conversation in India, it's great fun to allow multilingual puns, to bring in humor, to bring in people's, it's like this word and they can talk about it, right? It's fun. It makes people think about language all the time, right? Which otherwise they would miss. And really, when you bring in people's notion of gender into a classroom in terms of language, what comes in is also the notion of gender otherwise, right? You don't need to teach feminism in a school classroom. You can just talk language and make people feminists. Right? It can be done. Whether the system will allow you to that freedom in the classroom is a different matter, which, as I said, I can't judge, because I find that the system is getting more and more oppressive. I hope that answered you and the question.
Yes, I hope that.
The other thing about translation classroom, some people have directly asked me from Delhi University, because they teach translation, how do you judge a translation? Because we do translation classroom and we don't know all languages, right? And that's one thing, that in an English classroom, when you do translation, there are no, in various universities, it may be possible in certain states, universities, but otherwise, there is not as if there's a single pair of languages available in the classroom. Not everybody in Delhi, in JNU, in the MA classroom will know Hindi. Not everybody, they'll know English, but they may not all know Hindi. So they will bring other languages in. What we then look at is also English. And we have the translator there to tell us what that person is trying to do in English. And we have the translator there to introduce the original writer and the original work in English to us. So it's fun if you can get that going.
Yes, thank you, sir, for answering that question. It does at least give us ways in which we can do it or think of it. Though, yes, the entire structure and the hierarchies that are there in schools nowadays.
I'll tell you something. When I was teaching, I actually taught a few school children once, because in my school, they asked me that the weak students English, what do you do? I said, okay, I'll take a couple of classes and see what they, because they were doing extra classes. So I went in and I talked about the movies they'd seen. Obviously, they'd not seen English movies. They'd seen Hindi movies. We talked of the movies, and then they wrote about the movies, and they started writing the two classes. At the end of the second class, they were writing and speaking about the movies in English, though they had seen movies. So they were translating in a certain sense, but that translating was giving them greater confidence in their own English, in speaking and writing in English. And also, obviously, because this is only two classes, I should have done more, than maybe you could have seen more results. But I would accept a Hindi word coming in, right? Because they couldn't find an equivalent. It's fine. And then we talk about what could be equivalent, and it would be funny. And which is what led to my practice in MA classroom of getting people to translate Hindi film songs into English, which is just fun activity. It's not a serious activity. It's not graded, but it was fun. And everybody enjoys doing that and saying, how the hell does it sound so corny in English? How does it sound so bad in English? And to make it sound good, make it sound musical, find the equivalence. It's a great translation challenge.
I think that answers my question as well as Dinesh's question well. There's one question by Nishorgo. Nishorgo, would you like to ask it yourself? Can I? I think I'll read it for him. Is there any difference between different languages in terms of translatability? So is are some languages more translatable than the others?
Question really is seen from a different point of view. I see it from a different point of view. Because translatable into which language? That's the question, right? Obviously, languages that are close to each other, it is easier to translate from one to another. It's easier to translate from Urdu to Hindi and Hindi to Urdu than from Urdu and Hindi to Tamil, right? Or into Bodo. Or see what I'm trying to say. distance, it's spatial distance, but it's also in terms of language linguistic families, right? When we are talking, going towards the northeast, we're talking about complete different families of languages. If you're going south, you're looking at different families of languages. All of them have had impact of Hindi cinema, some resisted, some not resisted, etc., etc. Some resented rather than resisted. But translation is still difficult, right, when you go that far. But nearer with Hindi and Urdu, a lot of translation is simply in terms of script. You change the script and people seem to understand, right? So depends on translatability, depends on what language you're speaking. But remember, since there is also a point of view that a language is a complete sealed, almost sealed knowledge system, right? That is, the language makes you see the world in the way that you see it. It's because of the language you see it that way. Therefore, this can never be translated into another system which sees the world a different way, right? So that is, in a sense, languages are always mutually unintelligible. That's also a linguistic point of view, right? But we still try. We still try to reach across. We still try to translate. We still try to, and we will always do it. As we despair of translation, if you're translators, you know it. You'll always despair of translation. You always think it's not working, but you always keep trying.
Thank you for answering that. I think Nishorgo I think Nishorgo could not speak because he's not well. So he's also a part of Ashutosh and he helped me organize all of this. So I'd also take time to thank him. Nikhilesh has many questions, but there is some technical glitch from his side. So I'll just read all his questions.
Tell him, sure.
So he says that he's loving this session. And we all are. I can talk for myself. I feel blessed. I was really sad that I could not attend any one of you. Like I could never attend your classes because of the timing. I joined and then your superannuation. So
I'm sad that I'm not teaching you longer. It's one thing that I really miss.
But this was a pleasure listening to you. So the question, he has two questions. The first one is, I have recently encountered some writers who denigrate translation as something secondary and call them transcreators instead. They keep telling me of Fitzgerald's rhyme over Omar Khayyam. How do you see the term transcreation as a translator apart from feeling offended at it?
All right. Actually, I realize now that I didn't answer one of Hindu's questions, but I'll get back to that and then we can finish that if we're really running out of time. But Nikhilesh, listen, transcreation was a term that is popularized in India by P. Lal, who's written 7 essays on it. It's available. And in Latin America by Camus, people have talked about translation all the while. And in a sense, our tradition of rewriting is transcreation, if you wish, right? I'm not offended by the term, but I just think it's making too much of it because translators are translators and translators are translators. So why put in a term as translator? Why not simply stay with translator, right? So that's what I would say, right? That all translators are creators in their own way. Because in a sense, to use Pibak in a very, what can I say, basic matter, you kind of surrender to a text, as he says. You take the text, you're the best reader of the text, you read it so well, and then you are the writer in a different language. You're the writer in a different language. So in effect, you've taken it and then it becomes yours and you're writing it, right? That is the act of translation all the time, right? That's the act of translation. This is what I'm saying, your emphasis, your interpretation, because Spivak's, Mashweta Devi is not necessarily the Mashweta Devi people read in Hindi, not the Mashweta Devi people read in Tamil. So it's people, as Mashweta Devi once said in a conference session that I was sharing, that she is read by English students as some kind of feminist, whereas she is a political activist. She was very offended that she was being read as a feminist, right? But she kept saying, I'm not a woman writer, I'm a writer, I'm a political writer, I'm an activist writer. So that's what translation does to you. A translation can, because somebody wants to emphasize the way you're talking about women, you become a feminist writer. That's the translator who's done that. The translator, the way they translated the forward, the written, what they've written around, right? So the other thing was Indu's first question, which is, I'm sorry I didn't answer that. When somebody, I think it was, when someone talks about where you are in a different language, because they stayed there for a while, they're already translating. So their work of creation, as all works of creation only, but here even more so clearly, even so clear that if I'm going to be writing about in Hindi about my experiences of Kerala, I'm actually translating Kerala into Hindi, my experiences into Hindi, which were partly in Malayalam, what interesting around, right? So into Hindi. That then gets translated into English. So I'm reading a very obvious translation of a translation. Now, the person translating English, first of all, the person who wrote it in Hindi, what were the intentions of the writer writing Hindi? You can read in the Hindi text. The writer doesn't need to tell you. Then the intention of the English translator is available in the English. Is it written by a Malayali? It's a translation by Malayali who's upset that Kerala has been, depicted in a certain particular manner, or certain incidents have been narrated in a particular manner. That will come out in that translation. So it's an interesting political read of both the Hindi and the English from someone who's rooted in Kerala and reads, and so it's an interesting, these are all interesting instances of translation which you'll come across all the time in India. One of the things I say is that when I read a text from a metropolitan city, even to sometimes smaller towns, I'm reading in a monolingual text, perhaps. I'm reading a translation because they're talking about people coming from elsewhere, influences coming from elsewhere, other languages impacting on them. So if I'm reading a text based in Kannada, Maharashtra border, Karnataka-Maharashtra border, there'll be Marathi influence, even in lives which are supposedly of people who don't know the other language well or who don't live in the other language, it'll be there. So, and also, as I said, other experiences, other cuisines, other dress codes, everything, and ethics of various kinds will all be there, right? And politics will be there. So it's fun to translate. You can take a Malayalam text and translate it. You will think Malayalam is completely Malayalam, and you start realizing to translate. Oh no, there is this influence of Urdu. Oh, there is this English thing coming in. Oh, there is French in this. You start seeing all the other languages that inhabit that text, right? And then it's even more so if you look at a Bombay or a Delhi or a Madras text or a Calcutta text. Right? What is a Calcutta text for Marathis? So, for example, before the Bengalis kill me, we should finish.
Indu, we are sorry that I did not see that your answer was not, the question was not answered. I'm really sorry for that.
I should have.
No, it was interrupted actually because someone said something and I did not mute them. So I'm sorry for it. And I hope that Indu, your question is answered now. I would also like to ask, Nikhilesh had another question for us. For sir, my second question is this. Often I hear from some senior poets here that which is untranslatable in poetry is the authentic, essential part. This is given as an excuse to why our poetry doesn't make enough mark outside. How does you see this as a poet and a translator?
Let me give you something outside poetry as well here. People keep saying that if a text is completely rooted in its language, all its references are within the language. All the text that it refers to, everything refers to within the language. Then the more and more it does that, the less and less translatable it is. Right? That is one position. So the poetry therefore seen as lyrical, from the heart, completely in that language, so difficult to translate. Right? But it's the same as in the other text. You read it. It depends on how well you read it, how much you like it, how much it's yours, and how much the other language is yours, and you just recreate your experience of reading in the other language. And that should be possible. Nobody is going to look at one-on-one equivalent. It's not going to be the same poem, because if it is the same poem or the same text from a completely Tamil, rooted scale, then I have to read it in Tamil, then I have to read it in Odia. There's no way, right? But as I said, because if it has the same text, but if I want to read a text that gives me a semblance of that experience of reading that poem in Odia, then translation works. Translation will always work. That is my experience of translation. And I've seen people, as all of us have, we read Ramanujan, for example, who's translated completely rooted religious texts. It's possible. Why not?
So if you have a few more minutes to spare, I have a few questions. Two more questions. So my work is on Ram Leela, and because you were discussing how in one of the texts, when Ram is leaving and asks Sita not to come along, she says that, do you remember any other Ramayan where Sita does not go along with Ram? So when we talk of translations, there is always this memory, even in those texts where translators were really given that place of privilege and authority, even there we see that there is the memory of the past texts. So how, in a translation, how do we see the memory of the original, and how does it help or kind of becomes a hurdle in the work of the translator?
I tell you, this is a question that years ago, Meenakshi Mukherjee and I were talking about, right? And she was saying, Prasad, who are the readers of translation? Who are the readers? So I said, obviously people who don't know the language, right? I mean, I was thinking, that's how I read French text. That's how I read all my European text. That's how I read my Latin American text. Because it's available in English, Russian, all my Russian text. We even did an MPhil course on Russian literature in Delhi University, which is completely in English, reading the English translations. And nobody ever said, how is this a course in Russian literature? Right? So, and nobody ever said that. It was done by the famous A.N. Call, and we all were in awe of him, and we did Russian literature. We were all Russian literature, and we did it in English. So, this thing about the past, that what is the past, what is the Russian out there, didn't hamper us at all. We never thought of what would have been in Russian. We never thought of any of these texts. So when Meenakshi asked me who reads, she said, listen, you know what happens? I said, what? She said, Bengali texts when they're translated to English, it's mostly read by Bengalis, and all they do is to talk about how the translation gets everything wrong. Right? And she said, I'm sure it happens in Tamil, I'm sure it happens in other languages. You just too Delhi a person. You don't know this, right? You don't know this. I was thinking, I thought about it. I said, I haven't really heard it with Tamils, but maybe it's true of Bengalis, right? And I was thinking, Tamils who know Tamil would never read the translation. And if they don't know Tamil, they would read and thank you. it didn't work the way she said. But the past, as the original as a past, is a hindrance to the reader. It's a huge hindrance to the reader if the reader knows the original. They cannot enjoy translation. My point is, why should they even do it? Why should they enjoy it? It's up to them. The good thing is, of course, if you know the original partly in a sense and you're reading this, then you're getting two entry points. Right? And that's what I always like. That suppose I don't know the original, but I've got two translations that I understand. Let's say one in English and one in Tamil or Hindi, and I can read both. The Hindi, Tamil, English give me a way of approximating what you are now talking about, the original text. But I still don't think of the original text. I think of these as three different ways of reading, enjoying something, right? And I'm not sure at all that they help me to approximate Marquez or anyone else, right? And I don't look for Marquez in these texts. I just look for readings of Marquez in this text. And I don't enjoy the readings. They all may be untrue to Marquez. I will not know. Right. So this business for the translator, for the translator is a problem always, because if you think of the text you're translating or the writer you're translating is a very famous writer. It's a very famous text, and you'll be judged in those terms. So I'm translating Tagore, I have to be very careful. That kind of stuff. Don't translate Tagore. Not at this stage of the career. Do it later on and people say, let's see what she's done to Tagore. She should have done something interesting. Then do it. When people respect you and look for you in the translation and not for Tagore.
So Nikhilesh says that to Delhi a person reminded me that poem of yours, Always an Outsider.
In Delhi without a visa. Yeah.
Thank you for answering my question. I have a lot many questions. I wish I get a chance to meet you. Can I ask one more question and then we can wind up? If
it's up to you, your time, your Google.
So my question is that I am learning French. I know Hindi, English, a bit of Bengali, and French. Now, while learning, we have this translation exercises. But French and Hindi has aap and tum. Bengali also has that, and French also has vous and tu. But English doesn't have this. So when we talk of foreignization, how do we overcome these structural hurdles or structural restrictions that are there in the language itself?
So let me give you again, I like to come from always a different place, right? So I have written a paper on how to translate Dalit literature from Tamil. Now, certain gestures and linguistic gestures are very important for writers to show hierarchization, structures of oppression in language. So in Tamil, which also has two, etc., the upper caste, young child from the upper caste will call an older man, much older man, he was a very old man, a grandfather like figure, who's from a lower caste, in the singular, ni, tu. But that old man will call that young child up. How do you do this in English? Because this is being enacted in language out there, that person, that the writer does not need to more than write just these words. I said that regardless of where you appears in the language, if it is a term of respect given to caste, given to age, whatever respect, it should come with a capital Y, regardless of whether it's the middle of the sentence or the beginning of the sentence. And regardless of where you in the singular looking down on age or caste or whatever is used, it should be in the lowercase, regardless of where it is in the sentence. You can begin a sentence with lowercase u. Why? So that is the way you enacted what is being linguistically enacted there, you enact in terms of script out here, right? So you have to think of this kind of equivalences that you can work out. How do you work these out, right? What do you use? And will people understand? For example, some of the things that people don't understand in English is that the informal you in older English was thou. People use thou as respectful now sometimes, so they want to create the thing. But if you look at that, thou was the one which lack of respect, and you was a respectful term. So they moved everything to you. They became democratic. Everybody is you, right? So when you have to play with this now, right? So you can, if you can use thou as respectful, you can actually very quickly footnote somewhere saying, I'm using that as respectful, or make sure it's shown so. And it doesn't matter if people say, oh no, it was not respectful to begin with. It doesn't matter. In your rendering, it is.
That surely was helpful. And because I'm also working, because my research is also on Ram Leela, and I have to write most of the time in English. So I'm really worried about the diacritics and everything. So I think
you read Anuradha Kapoor, haven't you?
Yes, sir.
If you read Anuradha Kapoor, you know how to go about it.
Yes, but still, like making it a part of making that system a part of myself will take time for me, I think. But this was really helpful for not only me, for everyone. I feel blessed. I'm grateful. I was a bit nervous, but after listening to you, you're very humble, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for this wonderful, insightful, lovely talk. And this all really introduces us well to the topic of translation in the classroom and translation, literary translation per se. So thank you, sir. And it was a wonderful session. Uh, and I think all of us felt the same way. So thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Anyone would like to say something? So
Sorry,
yeah.
I just quickly looked at the chat. It's okay. Yeah. We can
Yes,
leave.
so everyone is writing their comments in the, everyone is thanking you. Durva
Yes.
says thank you. Matri says thank you.
I will leave.
And if it's all right, I would like to wind up the session now. We have taken a lot of your time, and we are really grateful that you gave this talk. So thank you, sir, for this wonderful session.
Yeah. Can I leave now? Okay.
Yes.
See you all. Bye.
Bye.